my Nanny, oh. Behind yon hills where Lugar flows, 'mong moors and mosses many, oh. The wintry sun the day has closed, and all awat in Annie, oh. The westland wind blows loud and chill, the next with murk and rainy, oh. But I'll get my plate and out I'll steal another hill in Annie, oh. My Nanny's charming, sweet and young, nae art for while stay when ye, oh. May I'll before the flattering tongue that would beguile my Nanny, oh. Her face is fair, her heart is true, her spotless as she's bonny, oh. The opening gown, what would you, nae purer is than Nanny, oh. Our country lad is my degree, and few there be that ken me, oh. But what care I how few they be, and welcome I to Nanny, oh. My riches o's my penny fee, and I'm unguided canny, oh. But world's gear ne'er troubles me, my thoughts are all my Nanny, oh. O'er all get man daylights to view, his sheep and kye thrive bonny, oh. But I'm as blithe that odds has flew, and has nae care but Nanny, oh. Come weal, come woe, I care na buy, I'll tak what heaven will send me, oh. Nae other care in life have I, but live and love my Nanny, oh.
Well, hi folks. You've joined us for the second part of our conversation with Rab Wilson, and Rab's just given us a great rendition of a song that I've not really heard before. So I'm hoping Rab can tell us a little bit about it. First of all, let me introduce Jim Thompson, my fellow interviewer in these episodes. Hi Jim, how you doing?
Doing great. Hi everybody.
Rab, not a song I've heard very often, if at all. Can you tell us something about it?
Well, the song's My Nanny, oh, and in most Burns collections, where the sort of poems and songs are kind of presented in a chronological order, the mere academic tomes, it's a very, very early work. It usually comes in number 4. It's the 4th work that Burns wrote or is known to have written. And it's a beautiful wee love song, and I think it's got a beautiful melody, and it's one of the kind of melodies that a singer can easily crash and burn on because it's a fiddle tune, and in most Burns songs were fiddle airs and tunes, and they have an octave leap. You know, you get these octave leaps in them. So if you don't pitch it right to start with, then you're going to either be too high or too low. So you've got to pitch it just right. Burns talks about this song in Kinsley's Poems and Songs, Robert Burns, that has the kind of background to all Burns's works and critiques of them. That Burns says that you know, a lot of love songs are rubbish because the people that write them don't really feel passion. You know, they're just writing these as an exercise. But a true love song should be written with passion and sung with passion, and that he was the protagonist in this story. He reckons that he was the hero in this wee love story of the young hub boy who his penny fee that he gets and walking from maybe Yin Valley or Yin Glen ever into the next for a tryst with his lover, young Nanny. And it's just this beautiful song. It's a song that maybe deserves to be heard a bit more. But there's a wheen of Burns songs and airs as we can that deserve to be heard a bit more. It's one of the thoughts with the Burns world maybe is that we tend to get a handful of poems and a handful of songs, and that's all you ever hear, you know. But there's a whole wealth of wonderful stuff there that should be read and sung, and we should hear a lot more, Doug.
Yeah, very definitely. Well, hopefully we'll hear more Burns from you later on in this this second part of your life with Robert Burns. When we left the first episode, you told us about being born and brought up in Newcumnock and your school days, and you'd gone on to tell us about your life as a punk rocker and starting as an engineer with the coal board. But we only briefly mentioned that you then moved on to become a psychiatric nurse with the NHS. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I think we'd mentioned the last time I'd just taken off my pit helmet, my bits, and flung them onto the conveyor belt to go to the dirt hopper. And on the Monday morning, and that was on the Friday, and the Monday morning I commenced nurse training at Dumfries at the Crichton. And I lived in there for the first year and a half. I had a room in Queensbury West, and I was lucky. It was a very big room. It was a great big room, and because I had a lot of gear and musical gear and stuff, and I had it all set up in this room. And the woman that was the kind of the home warden, or whatever you like to call it, would be champing my door. I'd be battering the drum machine and the keyboards going, and waking up all the folk that were working in the night shift in the nursing home. So that didn't get down very well. But in fact, I just did a kind of similar in conversation like this about nursing just the other week there with Dr. Valentina Bold, who's well known in the Burns world, in the world of academia. And she's leading a kind of a project at the Crichton now to speak to not retired nurses and folk that worked at the Crichton about their careers there back in the day. So I had a long conversation with her about that very thing, working with these, working with in the nursing and at the Crichton Hospital at that time. And it was quite, I mean, I can remember working in wards with elderly patients, and this would be about it was 1986. And these people would have been, 70, 80 years old at the time. A lot of them, maybe some of them had come through the Second World, certainly had come through the Second World War and stuff like that. And I can remember one guy in particular, who was very pleasant and charming and conversed away, a nice guy, an old guy. And I remember checking his notes, and it transpired that he'd been one of the bomber crew in the Second World War. And on his notes in the front, it was just stamped LMF. And I wonder what was that. And it transpired that was low moral fibre. This guy probably had PTSD, as we recognise it now, but had a nervous breakdown, flying in these in bombing missions, and probably had a major breakdown, and ended up, spending virtually the rest of his life in a psychiatric institution, as it was at that time. And funnily enough, another interesting story. This patient will be dead and long gone now, so I can mention the name, because the name's kind of relevant, because it's an interesting story. There was another old patient who'd been admitted. And he was a bit of a hermit that lived round about Thornhill and Carr Bridge. He was an old guy that lived as a bit of a hermit, strange character. And his name was Peter Sievers. Peter Sievers. And we admitted him. And he was very paranoid about he had quite a marked foreign accent. And long story short, it transpired that Peter Sievers was, I think he was perhaps Lithuanian, and he'd signed up and was in the German army. He had been a German prisoner of war and stayed here in Britain because the country he came from had been, taken over by the Russians after the war, and he was terrified that he'd be sent back and would be shot by the Russians for joining up with the Germans. And I can remember he had some old photo albums, and I can remember leafing through this photo album, and here were pictures of him as a young man sitting in the Champs-Élysées with Eiffel Tower in the background in Paris when the Germans occupied Paris, and there was photos of the Jewish ghetto. What was the famous ghetto in was it Prague? Or there was a famous Jewish ghetto that was emptied out by the Nazis, and he had been there as well. This guy had been right in the heart of these momentous historic events, and here he was. He'd ended up, an all broken man in the Crichton, and he would have lived his days out peacefully, But these were some of the stories that you came across in nursing at that time.
And how long were you in nursing for, Rab? How long did that career last?
From the 3rd of February 1986, and it would be, I think, February in 2012. And I left, of course, following the whistleblowing episode at NHS Ayrshire. I was involved in a big sort of whistleblowing carry on. This was due to a patient who was a Secretary of State patient who had absconded for the ward that I was in, and it was a real disaster. Nobody had spotted that he'd disappeared, basically. And I come in the night shift, and we found he was gone, and there was a whole, emergency about this. And I was supposed to, they decided to have a serious adverse event report, an SAER, serious adverse event report into this event. And I thought, well, I'll get to tell my story here, because it was me that managed the whole incident and recorded it all. And I had to phone the government, phone the chief of police and that at the time. And lo and behold, I wasn't called to be a witness in this report. So I was annoyed about that, and I said, well, I want to see a copy of this report when it's completed. And Ayrshire dug their heels in and wouldn't even let me see a copy of the report. But through strange circumstances, a copy of the report fell into my hands. There was a copy going about that had been wildly redacted, that was virtually unreadable, just page after page of blacked out pages. But I was given a full copy of the report, and basically it was a pack of lies that had been told about this incident, and they blamed somebody for it who was completely innocent. And I took Ayrshire to task over this. And this went on for 2 or 3 years. And at that time, I was very naive, didn't know about, freedom of information and stuff like that. But I learned quite quickly. So I started using FOISA, the Freedom of Information Act Scotland, to ask some searching questions at Ayrshire. Because the penny dropped to me. I said, well, if this is the length they're going to cover up one serious adverse event report, what are they doing with all the other serious adverse event reports? And again, it transpired that virtually nobody had got to see any of these adverse event reports. These are reports that people are meant to see so that they learn from such incidents so they don't happen again. But there was no learning at all, and the reports were all been basically suppressed. So that's eventually I totally blew the whistle. I gave it to the newspapers. They splashed it in the front page. There was a big front page, the front page of the Daily Record. The headline was "Deceived." Remember that? Deceived. And Ayrshire and Arm were in serious trouble over that. The chief executive left, and the medical executive, the director left as well. And the new chief executive, John Burns, who has also just left in this past week or so for things that I'm perhaps involved with now. That's another story. But I met with that John Burns, who was the new chief executive at the time, and he said, "Well, Rab," he says, "what can we do to restore your faith in NHS Ayrshire and Arm?" And I basically said, "Well, John," I says, "you can write me a big cheque and give me my pension, and I'll be off out that door." And he says, "Well, if that's what you want, Rab, we can have a look at that." And he couldn't have a look at it quick enough, I don't think, Doug. So that was the end of my nursing career. I was glad to see the back of them, and they were quite glad to see the back of me. Yeah. Well, since then, I've went on campaigning for social justice in the NHS, and in fact, just this very week, in page 2 of the Ayrshire Post, I can send you a PDF copy of that article if you want to pass it, flag it up. I've been involved with a guy who was a friend and a colleague of mine, Neil Alexander, who was 64, a nursing assistant, a real good guy, a good man. And he, in an underlying condition, he had a heart attack, he had stents in and things like that. And there was a COVID outbreak on his ward, and he was terrified he would get COVID. And he phoned up and tried to get a hold of managers to say that he was scared to go in and stuff like that. And they were just ignored, and nobody got back to him. So he turned up for his work. He caught COVID at the end of January, and he died on St. Valentine's Day, on the 14th of February. It was something that it was what the term in inquiries is as a never event. It should never have happened. It was totally avoidable and totally preventable. And this was allowed to happen. And Ayrshire and Arm have broken some serious rules, which could be regarded as crimes in this case. The incident the death wasn't reported to the Health and Safety Executive, as it must be, and it wasn't reported as a RIDOR incident, which was reporting of infection and dangerous diseases. These things never happen, and that is seriously bad. Somebody's got to be in big trouble for that. So with me and my friends, we've given a big report to the police, and the police are now beginning to investigate this. So I'm sure there'll be lots more to read about this story in the future.
Well, we'll all look out for that, Rab. It's good that somebody's standing up for whistleblowers and forcing the investigation into these things. But we'll move on in case we get into some dangerous ground with our discussions on that. Let's go over to one of your hobbies. You're really into older bicycles, aren't you?
Aye, that's a thing that I've got more into it in recent times, and I think even more so during the lockdown. But I was always like cycling, even from as a boy. I was never into it as a kind of club type person or as a racer or anything like that. It was a means of transport in rural areas. That was how boys got about bikes. That probably the best Christmas I ever had would have been about 1972, I think it would be, and getting a bright yellow rally chopper for my Christmas. It was the best Christmas ever, getting this rally chopper. And I wish I'd kept it, because they go for a fortune now, these bikes. So it's one gap in my collection that I don't have, is a rally chopper. So if one of the boys have got you in a shed somewhere, then just give me a shout. I would love to have you in again. But I went on to kind of racing bikes and touring bikes and mountain bikes as getting into my 20s and 30s. Cycled all around the hills and of Nissdale and east southern Ayrshire, been all around these areas with my bikes. But I really liked, I was wanting a Flying Scot, the famous Flying Scot bikes, which were built in Glasgow. And in previous generations, these were the bike to have. This was the Rolls Royce, the Ferrari of bicycles, a Flying Scot built by Rattray's in Glasgow. And I always wanted one. And I managed to get one in my kind of early 30s. But the frame was too big for me. It was far too big for me, actually. But it was the only one I knew of and the only one I could get. So I bought that. And I've since acquired about 7 of these bikes. And I've got them all restored. I've got various other things. I've got some exotic Italian bikes, Colnago, Theodore Pogacar, who's the yellow jersey in the Tour de France right now, and who won the mountain stage today. I watched him win it. It was brilliant. Pogacar is riding a Colnago bike. Colnago is recognised as the most successful bikes in the world. They've won more races than anybody else. It's a real Ferrari of Italy. So I've got a couple of kind of Colnago bikes, and a Bianchi, which is another exotic Italian bike. Hetchins, a Curly Hetchins. These are makes of bikes that are well known to anybody who's seriously interested in cycling. I send them. I usually send, if it's one I'm really restoring, I usually send the frame away to Bob Jackson's in Leeds, who are a long-established bike building, frame building and restoration firm. And they respray the bike to whatever colour you want, all the lug lining done on it and all different panels and things. They got all the original transfers. So the frame comes back looking like new. And I gather up the bits and pieces off of eBay and sales and things. And I try to, build them up as close to the original as possible. So I've got quite a collection of these now. And I built a big new shed to store them in. So I like getting out there and putting the digital radio on and just sitting at my bench in the shed and working in bits and pieces and building these bikes. And I got a great deal of pleasure from it. I really do.
So is this going to be the Nursery View Bicycle Museum of the future?
I'm the new Wallace Anderson, the new Cumnor. Some of the Ollians will remember Wallace Anderson. He was like a latter day Fred Dibner. He worked at the pit, Wallace, and he had his biler sit on in a bonnet. It was covered in oil, and he used to restore all push bikes and families in the 60s and 70s that couldn't afford a new bike for their lanes. They would go to Wallace Anderson, and they would usually be painted with a brush, and either paint it whatever colour paint that the council were throwing out at the depot, So there would be council green or council blue, red, and the folk would get a cheap bike for Wallace Anderson. So I feel as if I'm carrying on a great tradition in New Cumnock, I'm the new Wallace Anderson. He has to sort your puncture for 50 pence. I'm not quite, but youngins, as we know, that you hardly see youngins out in the street playing now. They're sitting looking at a screen and playing with computers and things like that, which is a real shame. It'd be great to see more youngins out kicking a ball or riding a bike, running about. It was something that our generation did a lot of. But it's a big hobby and an interest to have. And in fact, I've been asked, now that things are waking up a wee bit after COVID, there's a festival of cycling and food, I believe it is, that's happening in Castle Douglas on the 12th of August. It runs for 2 or 3 days. The 12th, I think, is a Thursday. It runs a Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And I've been asked to go down and give a reading of my Flying Scot cycle poem sequence. with the music that was written for it as well. So I'm doing that on the 12th of August, and then I'm giving a talk on the Friday just about my love of cycling and stuff that bikes I've built, things like that. You know, it's a bit anarchy, but if you like bikes and cycling, and if you like food, and we all like food, get yourself into Castle Douglas and get along to that. I think it'll be quite an interesting 2 or 3 days. So there we go. It's weird how where our hobbies and interests take us, and where things can go. You never plan these things, but stuff happens round about you, and suddenly you're invited into a different world. It's great.
Sounds fascinating, Rab. But to our knowledge, I don't think Robert Burns ever had a bike. But that's the best I can do to give us a link into talking a bit more about your interest in Burns, and perhaps a little bit about your own poetry.
But Joe Kennedy said at one of the next, the Bachelors Club, that a guy had chapped his door one day and said, "I want you to look at this, Joe. This is the actual lamp that come off of Robert Burns's bike." I think Joe let him down gently, I think.
But inside it, Joe, inside the back was another ready battery for the lamp.
So there you go. Maybe Burns was ahead of his times again.
I'll pass over to Jim to talk to you a bit more about your interest in Burns, because last time we got an epistle from you, but we didn't get much chance to talk to you about what you've done with your Burns career.
Sure.
Well, there's 2 or 3 things I'd like to get into, but first of all, being a Newcomnock boy, you need to tell people about your journey through Newcomnock Burns Club.
Right. Okay. Well, I suppose as a young man, as a teenager and through my 20s and even into my 30s, Burns really wasn't on my sort of radar much at all. I was working at the pit. I was working in the nursing. I was working shifts and things. I was playing in groups at the weekend. That was my big thing. I played in covers bands in the working men's clubs and the miners' clubs and the pubs all around Ayrshire and beyond for a good couple of decades. So I didn't really have much time for the Burns Club and that. But Jim had got involved in the Burns Club, and as I say, I had my Burns book, and I'd read a bit of Burns, and I was familiar with the sort of more common works and some of the more uncommon works, because I say that the book I showed you the last time, that my father had given me, that they'd won in the raffle up at the barn dance up Afton. And it's a very good Burns book, that. So I was lucky it was that Burns book. If it was something else, it might not have been as helpful. So Jim had been involved in the Burns Club, and I got kind of, asked to maybe go to the supper, attend a supper. So I think that was how it started. I attended the Burns supper, and I was because I was married to Margaret Gibson, as she was, from Sanker, and we lived in Sanker for 20 years. And because I was writing poetry, known for that then, Edwin Young, who was a great Burnsian for Sanker, got a notion in his head to resurrect the Black Joanne Burns Club in Sanker. And old Tom Johnson had kept it alive by paying the stents to keep the club going for years. So they resurrected it. And I was asked to come on board for that, because I was seen as somebody who was younger, that had maybe a bit of knowledge or ability in that area. So I get involved with that. So I ended up being on the committee at the Black Joanne Club. And as I attended the Newcomnock supper, I was invited onto the committee at Newcomnock as well. And I can't think how long I was in these committees. It must have been for, quite a few years. I've stood down to both the committees in the last few years, because, approaching 60, which is not a great age, but it's a time where I was retired, and so it's a bit. I'd like to make more time for me and do the things that I really want to do. You know, I was kind of a bit scun up and fed up with committees. And I don't just mean that the Burns Club. I was in various other committees to do with Scots language and the parliamentary working group on Scots language and the Scottish Language Centre and the Scottish Language Society, organisations like this. If you're seen as somebody who can perhaps do something and is somebody that makes things happen, you get invited on board. So I was involved deeply with these things for many, many years. So I'm kind of trying to kind of step a wee bit back for it, because there's lots of things we'd like to do in life. But Burns is, whether I'm in a committee or no, or whether I'm active in a club or no, you know, Burns is endlessly interesting. You know, he's a fascinating human being. Never mind, he's a fascinating poet or writer. He's a fascinating human being, and he's one of the great human beings of probably of human history. I mean, he's right there with anybody for human history who's famous or remembered. Burns is famous and remembered, and rightly so. You know, it's like that thing. The famous Longinus philosopher's writings. His essay on the sublime. You know, what something that's sublime, something that is beyond criticism. You know, something that is perfect, if you like. What makes something perfect? And the definition was that which is loved by all the people for all the time. And Burns's work, Burns's poems and his songs, maybe more so the songs, are loved by the people for all the time. And that makes his work sublime. And I don't think there's any greater accolade that perhaps that you can get in human terms. So we wouldn't want to read Burns.
You also mentioned there about your own stuff, and I know since you've retired to the health service, you've had 2 or 3, I would suppose, scriber in residence, I think would be the title I would use for them. It'd be interesting to hear about some of that.
Aye, well, I suppose the first, well, I was quite late, I suppose, in getting into writing poetry, and there's a history of that in Scotland. There's some great poets in Scotland that didn't really start writing poetry seriously or taking a serious interest in their writing until they were perhaps maybe about 40, you know. So I was kind of in that category. The great Willie Neal, who lived down in Galloway, but he came for Prestwick. I mean, he was about 40 before he started writing his poetry, and he wrote in the 3 Leads of Scotland. You know, he wrote in English, he wrote in Scots, brilliant writer in Scots, and he also wrote in Gaelic. And as a learned Gaelic speaker, he actually won the gold medal at the Mod. And that's an incredible achievement for a learned Gaelic speaker to win the gold medal at the Mod. So Willie Neal was a late developer in the poetry front, and I was kind of the same. But my poetry kind of, I think, improved quite rapidly over the space of a few years, because like Burns, Burns went through an intense period of poetry writing just before the Kilmarnock edition, and I think because of that the intensity of that period, he probably reached a much higher standard, the quality of the work that he wrote. But he did that as a very young man, you know. But I suppose that was the world he lived in. It was it had a huge following and an interest in Burns's day, where poetry now isn't quite as, you know, at the forefront of culture as perhaps it should be. But when I was about 40, my poetry had improved, and it was getting published here and there in magazines like Chapman, which is a very, you know, well recognised magazine, and Lallans, Scots Language magazine, Markings, and in the Dark Horse, Jerry Cambridge's magazine. So my poetry was getting recognised. and quite a lot of my poems were appearing in the Glasgow Herald. Leslie Duncan, who I know and is a friend now, Leslie Duncan, she liked my poetry and published quite a lot of my poems in the Glasgow Herald in the poetry column, and that was quite an accolade for that to happen. So, and then I get quite a big break because I was given the Robert Burns Writing Fellowship in Dumfries and Galloway, and that was quite a leap for me. That kind of tied in when I was going through the sticky patch with Ayrshire Nairn Health Board, and they were quite kind of the one that let's say they weren't as helpful as they could have been with that. Maybe because they didn't like me asking awkward questions and whatnot at the time. So that was a bit of a kind of sticky patch. But I did that writing fellowship, and good works came for that. I was being asked to contribute poetry more and more to events. Folk were aware of you. So the likes of that Creative Burns project, the big project in the homecoming year at the Dick Institute, and I got asked to write a whole series of poems for that relating to Burns, and these were the kind of jobs you were getting, and I was enjoying that, and it was a great time. And then latterly, I was given the Screever in residence post at the Burns Museum. Chris Waddle, who's the kind of the learning manager there, was very, very proactive in making that happen. He wanted a poet in residence, if you like, at the Burns Museum, and I got that post, and I was there for a number of years. They probably would have been happy to keep me on there, but I felt I'd done my time there, and we passed it on to Tracy Harvey, and I was very, very pleased that Tracy took over for me there, just to have a good Ayrshire voice, taking on the role of the Screever at the Burns Museum. So these are some of the things. These are some of the things that I've done in my career. I've read my poetry abroad, Dave. For Tartan Day in New York, I was invited over to New York, and I've read my poetry at the Walt Whitman Museum in Long Island. I've read my poetry there. Read in various events and venues in New York. The last Commonwealth Games, there was a kind of ploy set up with the Scottish government to have a kind of a crossover, taking poets from the Commonwealth to come here to Scotland to read their poetry, and sending Scottish poets to different countries in the Commonwealth. And I drew the short straw, and had to go to Jamaica for mine. So
that was hard.
It was a hard gig, but I did it. And no, it was absolutely wonderful. I mind being in there among all these, well-known writers from all around the world, some big names, and a lot of black writers, from around the world, like Sir Linton Kwesi Johnson. I was sitting together with Linton Kwesi Johnson, who was a big name back in the early 80s with the specials and the kind of reggae thing and sort of rap poets, if you like. And he was a big figure at that time in that movement. And sitting blathering with him, drinking cocktails in Jamaica, it felt very strange. And then one day we went in a minibus to this lagoon. It was the most exotic jungle sort of lagoon in the middle of nowhere. It was incredible, this place they took us to. And there was a couple of bands, and they took this picnic and set up all this picnic for us. And I'm sitting in the bus, and sitting in front of me is Salman Rushdie. So I'm sitting there blathering away with Salman Rushdie. It felt very, very surreal. At the time, it just kind of, I don't know, it probably just went over my head. But I've done these things, and they're interesting things. Who would have thought that because you sat down to screeve a line or two, a rhyming verse at the Barney Pit about Jim Marr blowing up the toilet with bowls of lean and cigarettes, that it would lead to you sitting at a picnic by a lagoon in Jamaica with salmon rushdie.
Tremendous.
But there you go.
Yeah. Rab, you've talked through a lot that you've done in your poetry career. Would this be the time to give us another wee reading? Anything handy there?
But Rab Wilson or Burns?
Well, Rab Wilson just now. We'll get back to Burns in a minute or two.
Okay. Right. Okay. Here's just like the song I sang. There's a wee of my works there that nobody ever gets to hear, or probably will hear. Maybe it's not a bad thing in a way, but this was an interesting book. This was Addressing the Bard. I don't know if that's that right. The back to front the way this is filmed with this thing. I'm not sure.
No, that's fine.
That's fine.
But it's called Addressing the Bard, and this was 12 contemporary poets respond to Robert Burns, and it was a thing that was a kind of ploy again that was set up with the Scottish Poetry Library, and they approached some big name poets to come and contribute to this book, and they had a list of Burns's poems, and each one of the poets got to choose one of the Burns's poems that they would like to respond to do a modernised version or an update or something like that, right? So they asked me to take part in this, which again was a real honour. Well, when was this? This again, I think it might have been about homecoming year, 2009 again. It was a purple patch in 2009-10. I was very busy at that time. So I said to them, right, I says, whatever poem is left, the poem that nobody else wants, I'll take that poem. So everybody chose a poem, and it was quite interesting what they chose. And you had some real Kent faces here. You had Jackie Kay, who's just been recently in the Scots Marker, Liz Lockhead, Professor Robert Crawford, Caroline Duffy, the poet laureate, Seamus Heaney contributed to this. And there's Rab Wilson sitting among them. So that's quite a curious thing. So I said, I'll take the poem nobody else wants. And can you guess what that poem was? You might have, I don't know, what do you think? What poem do you think nobody would want? Maybe in this day and age.
That's a difficult one. There's a lot to choose from, Rab.
So let's say Jim Thompson should ken.
Well, Tam Hashanta.
Holy Wally's Prayer. Nobody wanted to touch that. So I says, right, I'll take that and have a go. And at that time, I had kind of fallen out severely with the Labour Party. I used to be a minor, I used to be a Labour voter. But the tendency to these illegal wars and other weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. And Gordon Brown, I think, was in the hot seat at the time. So I decided to make it even hotter for him. And so this was what I wrote. I'll maybe read it all, but you could cut it a bit because it is the same length as Holy Wally's Prayer. But this is Holy Gordon's Prayer. There was a lot of research went into this poem because a lot of the phrases that you hear in it are directly taken from the Bible. And I'm no, I'm a bit of a kind of heathen, and so I had to do a lot of research into this. Like, say, you've got Kings 18:21, Numbers 22:6, Exodus 3:8, Leviticus 26:7, Exodus, Samuel, Leviticus, Kings, Deuteronomy. All this, virtually every stanza has got a line to the Bible worked into it. And it's written in standard Harvey meter, as it should be. So, Holy Gordon's Prayer. O Lord, my God, forgive this swither. Pray hear thy servant in his dither. Should I bide here or cross the river, braid Rubicon, for hum and haw does not look clever, or sod your own. Thou minds are bottled at yince afore, when Cameron let out sic a splore, the kens there's nought that he'd like more than an election. For him and all his Tory core, folks fell rejection. Sheer Lord, them wi' the mens to see the path that you hae guided me, would ne'er doot that my destiny is mappit out. Keep mind the world was saved by me, withouten doot. You read a Kent as foes I trod on, as oligarchs fell taint at Osborne. They felt my wrath, I strapped your sword on to reap them ill. Now kens I'm no Flash, just Gordon, sent at your will. Mind, it's no just the opposition that poses threats to my position. Plunkett, Clark, and in addition young Miliband. Could you no send them to perdition and rack your horn? But I'm the man that ye hae chosen, dreeping with benison o' unction, your horn I saw in Blair's expulsion to the desert air. I'd ne'er hae ta'en back Manderson had I no been share. Blair, on his throne, that was my chair. Now, dinna think I'm being unfair. Lord mine, 'twas you that kept him there for all the years, while thon sherry-ged smirking share wi' snipes and sneers. Whiles now, he thinks to get to heaven. You'll mind that war was his decision. They tens of thousands slain, his vision, nane doon to me. I pleaded with him, Tone, see reason. He didn't to see. And on it goes.
Very good.
Yep. I mean, I love your own stuff, and I've got to say, I still have Accent of the Mind sitting in my shelves here that I read regularly, which I know was your first book publication, and I would recommend it to the world. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. But in terms of Burns, I mean, you've obviously got your book there, and there'll be a wee works in there that you're fond of. Have you a few that you would call in and can I maybe persuade you to do a recitation of one of them?
Well, obviously, the most boys that are involved with Burns and the Burns world, and as someone who recites the poems, you know, there's a, you could say there's a special skill in reciting the poems. I've been able to recite the poems, but I believe that's something that virtually anybody could do. It's just the fact that we've kind of lost the ability, because in Burns's time, you know, everybody, the Waynes, the Ollians, they could all recite a poem or sing a song or play a musical instrument, whether it was a whistle or a fiddle, you know, or a Jew's harp. They could all do something. They all could entertain each other, and it's a kind of something that we've lost in society. And I think that kind of it's a bad thing for society. You know, that our ability for social interaction is being eroded, and we're allowing it to be eroded. So to hear poetry being read is it's a skill to memorise poems and read them, but it's a skill that I believe anybody could learn it, and they should have a goal. You start with a wee shorty and you work your way on to bigger things, and it's something that stays with you all your life. You know, if you were stranded in a desert island and you were a Burns reciter, you would always have these in your head. You know, they're a treasure store. I believe some folk that were taking hostages in the Middle East. There was was it Dr. Tom, whatever he was?
Tom Sutherland.
Aye. I believe he had a lot of Burns verse in his head that he was a great sort of comfort to him and a boon to him in that situation. And being able to recite poetry or have learned poems for rote is a thing to treasure for always. It's something you'll always hate. And there's various the poems. Some well known and some a bit more kind of unknown. I'd read up with Jim a wee while back about Burns's sonnet on sonnets. He wrote a sonnet, 14 lines, and it's all about, you know, the 14 lines of a sonnet, and he weaves all these things into it, and it's a very curious poem, and it leaves a lot of kind of questions unanswered, and trying to kind of unravel it is a, you know, it's a very thorny, and it's a very kind of thorny poem to try and, you know, unpick. You know, it's really is a tour de force. A poem that's not really heard or read either, but it's a lovely thing. And Burns just having fun. You know, he was totally just having fun with doing that poem. I used to do along Burns's poem, The Vision, and I've got my own thoughts about the Vision. You know, in the Vision, Sterto at Burns is talking about Benut's the weary flinging tree, you know, in the buyer, you know, threshing corn, separating the ears for the corn with the flail, the flinging tree, and he comes in, fun up and frozen and knackered, and he sits with the spades, and he's feeling very low, and he has this idea in his head that he's going to give up writing poetry. It's a worthless task, and nobody cares about it. I'm going to stop. And I think my own idea about this, and I've no proof about it, but most of Burns's poems are Burns being honest and talking about himself. And I think this, in The Vision, Burns is talking about himself here. And I think he's got into trouble. I think the backstory of this is he's been pooed up or had got into trouble either with the kirk or with locals. He's wrote a verse about somebody and it's blew up in his face, and he's got into trouble for it. And I think this is why he's feeling like that. And this is why he's talking about giving up writing poetry, because it just gets him into trouble. And then, of course, the door opens, and in walks a strange, green, mystical figure, which is Coiler, his muse. And she proceeds over the course of this long poem, which is written in two dwans, a D-U-A-N, a dwan. This is like two parts, a big, long, the Highland type poetry form. It's written in two sections. And she proceeds over this long poem to tell him why it's important to be a poet, and the history of poetry in Scotland, and all the great pantheon of famous Scots and names, and why poetry matters. And it's a wonderful poem, but it's not a poem that you ever hear being read these days, hardly ever. And yet it speaks so much, so passionately about why poetry and why being a poet should matter to us. And The Vision, to me, is one of the great Burns's works. So I have a passion for that poem. And of course, we're all freeing the moose. We're all freeing the moose, which you hear Wayne's Day. Wayne's are getting the moose today, or a verse or two of it. And Wayne's always do the moose as if it is a child's poem, and it is very much not a child's poem. It's a very serious poem about the fate and fatalism and chance and fortune. It's like, to me, when I talk about it sometimes from reading it or speaking about it, I say it's like Frank Capra's film, It's a Wonderful Life. You know, the film that we get at Christmas with James Stewart in it, you know, where the hero in it is, everybody goes off into the world to make their fortune, and he stays in this wee village. Was it something Falls? I can't remember the name of it. And he stays there, and he runs a wee local sort of a loan company to help folk buy a house, and he's a good guy. And he just gets kind of taken a leno with this really wicked, evil, big business person in the town. And it's how your life can be going along quite smoothly, and then by chance, something bad happens and your life can be totally ruined or derailed. And that's what, to me, that's the story of the moose here. You know, you can be getting on with your life, but suddenly you're made unemployed, or you get a serious illness, or there's a marital breakdown, or the death of somebody close, and it can totally derail your life. You know, we never know what fate has in store for us round the corner, and it's that kind of musing on that kind of dark fatalism that goes on in this poem. And at that time, Burns had just lost a young brother. His young brother had just died, and then he lost his father. So I think Burns, that these things were very, very much on Burns's mind when he was writing To a Moose. And it's not a wee flippant poem for Waynes. The Waynes always do it, but it's a very serious philosophical meditation.
Well, you've laid it in there, so I'm going to have to ask you to recite it.
I should be able to do it by memory, but I'm not going to take the chance. So, To a Mouse, on turning her up in her nest with the plough, November 1785. Wee sleeket, cowering timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou needna start a war sae hasty with bicker and brattle. I would be laith to run and chase thee with murder and pattle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor born companion and fellow mortal. I doubtna whiles, but thou may thieve. What then, fair beastie, thou min grieve. A demon icker in a thrave's a small request. I'll get a blessing with a lave and never miss it. Thy wee bit pussy, tay and ruin, its silly wa's the winds are strewn, and Nathan new to big a newin of foliage green, and bleak December's winds ensuing, baith snail and keen. Thou saw the field lay bare and wast, and weary winter coming fast, and cosy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash the cruel coulter past out through thy cell. That wee bit heap o' leaves and stibble has cost thee money a weary nibble. Now thou's turned out for all thy trouble, but hoose or hold, to thole the winter's sleety dribble, and Cranrach call. But Mousey, thou art no thy lane, and proving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang aft a glide, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared with me. The present only toucheth thee. But oh, I backward cast my ear on prospect drear, and forward, though I cannae see, I get and fear.
Well, Rab, that was a great poem to finish off with. And our scheme was to get you to come back and tell us more about your life with Robert Burns. So it just leaves me to say thanks very much for your time and telling us about your life with Robert Burns, Rab Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe, cronies.